Hey, everybody, it's Pastor Ty. We're here for a sermon recap, checking in on how everything went on Sunday, where we covered Mark chapter 10, verses 1 through 16. This, of course, covering matters of the heart is what the sermon title was. I don't even know if I told everybody the sermon title, if I'm honest, but the idea is matters of the heart, divorce, marriage, culturally pertinent issues. So I'll just get started with where we got started on Sunday. And just mention that it's fascinating that the Pharisees thought to bring, of all things, this to Jesus, a pertinent issue in their day, something that they were fighting about and debating contemporarily, this is something that was on their mind. And if an issue and topic was on the mind of the Pharisees and they saw fit to bring it to Jesus, then it stands to reason that we ought to do the same. That was the first point we made on Sunday. And so when culture is aflame with various issues or debates or whatever it is, that the church can't shrink away from it. In fact, if anything, that's when the church has to shine the brightest and clearest and most joyful, and recognize that if the time is fulfilled, like Jesus said in Mark 1, and the kingdom is at hand, and that our posture needs to align with that kingdom, and we need to believe in the good news that Christ is bringing, then that means that stains everything, every debate, every issue, no matter what it is. And so we get from the very beginning of Mark's gospel this understanding that Jesus has come to disrupt every institution and every cultural concept that we have. And so the church can't shrink away from any issue because they have to orient it to the kingdom. That's and to their king. And so everything is going to transcend, everything is going to level up. That's the idea. Now, the interesting thing is when the Pharisees bring to Jesus the issue of divorce, it's interesting that Jesus asks them to hearken back to Moses, because in effect what he's doing is he's creating a trap, because Jesus knows where he wants to go with this topic. And so he starts with Moses because Moses gives the closest thing to an endorsement of divorce that you're going to find in the Old Testament, where Deuteronomy 24 verse 1 speaks to, if a woman finds no favor in the eyes of her husband because of some indecency, he is allowed to write her a certificate of divorce. And so the idea was, if for some reason, which seems to be cloaked by the cultural protocol of Moses's day, if a woman has fallen out of favor in the eyes of her husband, if something indecent occurred, that's when he's allowed to hand her a certificate of divorce. But the ancient Jews really squabbled over what that meant. And so you had the school of Shammai, which had a very strict rabbinic interpretation of this law, and essentially said the only thing that would cause a woman to find no favor in her husband's eyes would be adultery. So no favor, that's the indecency. You actually have what could be a proxy for that in Jesus's day, when Joseph, an honorable man, learns that Mary's pregnant and seeks to divorce her quietly. So the idea is he might have been thinking of Deuteronomy 24:1 when considering what he was going to do next, prior to his angelic meeting that was soon to come. However, that wasn't the only school of thought. The other school of thought was the school of Hillel, which had the laxest and widest interpretation of what that could mean. And so we talked on Sunday about how various commentators within the school of Hillel thought that the husband's discretion extended all the way to, did your wife spoil a dish of food? Did your wife speak disrespectfully to your relatives? Does your wife, is she too argumentative? Is the idea that the neighbors could hear her voice when she's nagging you? Rabbi Akiba actually went so far as to say, if a man sees a woman who is fairer in his eyes than his wife, he can hand his wife a certificate of divorce. And so this was a contemporary issue in Jesus' day, that the Pharisees were definitely seeking an actual answer to, how do we handle divorce? And the irony is, while divorce is as rampant as it's ever been in Western culture, the fascinating thing is that we're almost talking about two entirely different enterprises, because the debate that the Pharisees bring to Jesus is, when can a man divorce his wife, circa Deuteronomy 24:1? She's fallen out of favor and decency, and the man initiates a certificate of divorce. What we have today couldn't be any further from that. We have, in Jesus' day, 100% of divorces are carried out by men. They're all because of a fault, and you have to document what the fault is, and you have to hand a certificate. Today, we have a scenario where most divorces in America are no fault. Okay, so it's a no fault divorce. Irreconcilable differences is a suitable reason. Compatibility can be the reason for the divorce being instituted, and 70% of American divorces are initiated by women. And so we have what can only be deemed a pole shift in our culture compared to what Jesus was talking about. And so what that means for us today, and what it means for what happened in this scenario with Jesus and the Pharisees, is this: the issue concerning divorce, or really any topic in the New Testament, is not that the scripture is too hard. The point is that the human heart is too hard. And so we don't have a, man, the scriptures are hard problem. We have a, I have a hard heart problem. That's the underlying concern of most of the scriptures, is that the human heart is hardened and is not softened to and receptive to the calls of God. And so when Ezekiel 36 tells us that God intends to give us a new heart and a new spirit, that he is going to take away our heart of stone and give us a heart of flesh and give us his spirit and put it into us, we ought to be thankful for that. And so we spoke a lot about how the primary issue behind divorce or anything else is a heart issue. It's how receptive are we to the divine ideal? And that gets to the next section we covered on Sunday, which is this concept of the divine ideal. And the irony is that Jesus asks the Pharisees to hearken back to Moses because he's trapping them. He's putting them into a theological trap. He sends them to Moses and then says, Moses wrote that law because you have hard hearts. And then Jesus harkens back even further to the ultimate ideal and sends them to Genesis 1, where he says, how did God make you? Male and female. And because he made you male and female, what do? You marry one another. And how do you marry one another? Genesis 2:24, the man shall leave his father and mother, cling to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And so what Jesus is getting at here is that marriage, according to Jesus, is less about Moses and more about what Genesis founded the whole human enterprise to be about, that marriage is permanently fused to a person's sex and to the act of sexual intercourse. And so the idea is that from the beginning, the concept here is that when God created humanity, the intent was male, female, they marry and they proliferate. And that's my final point in this section. Jesus is making the argument that started in Genesis, that marriage is the foundation of all civilizational thriving. That for humans to truly thrive, what you need is man and woman coming into marriage, loving one another in this marriage, creating this system, creating this environment. And when kids show up in this environment, they are enraptured by this setting and they seek to do the same. So this is how we're to procreate. This is how we are to teach and raise our kids. And this is what the kids aspire to, that the ideal that the husband and wife set in the home becomes what the child desires in their own life. And the proliferation is supposed to get out of control in the best possible way. That was the divine ideal. So Jesus says, quit worrying about this law of Moses that only reflects your hardness of heart. Go back to the ultimate ideal, that man and woman marry. They create a home environment their kids want to replicate. And this creates the foundation for societal flourishing. Now, the disciples had heard all of this and have more questions. And it's fascinating because when the disciples come to Jesus in the home setting and say, hey, we need you to dig deeper and give us a more clear answer on this, notice that Jesus's answer to the disciples is even harder for them to receive than what he told the Pharisees prior. And why? Why is it that Jesus goes even harder with the disciples? Well, here's his answer. Jesus reasons that if marriage is a sacred vow and it's inseparable from the act of sex, that means that divorce is inherently a matter of adultery. And what Jesus is saying in this text is that no matter what, when a divorce occurs, those breaking of vows is going to lead to adultery. What Jesus is arguing is that adultery either is the catalyst for a divorce, adultery occurs, thus a divorce ensues, or a divorce occurs, and then on the back end, adultery occurs. We get this directly from the text. Jesus says in verses 11 and 12, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. So the idea is even if adultery didn't cause the divorce, post-divorce, adultery will ensue because this breaking of the bond occurred. And it's fascinating that Jesus said, and if a woman leaves her husband, she causes adultery. Because Jesus is in effect seeing into the future, seeing into to an institution that doesn't even exist yet. And so, in short, what we get here, friends, is that Jesus had a higher opinion of marriage than virtually anybody else in human history. That Jesus's view of marriage is such a higher bar than virtually anybody else expects. And it's fascinating how Jesus chooses to end this passage. We once again have children, throngs of children coming to Christ. We have the disciples once more trying to get them to go away. And we have Jesus, we're told, indignant with the disciples' desire to get the children away. And I don't think it's an accident that this passage closes with children once more being embraced by Christ, because it's children who bear the heaviest burden of divorce today. Let me give you some statistics that we read on Sunday to kind of drive home this point. After divorce, according to a 50-year longitudinal study put out by the National Bureau of Economic Research, if a child experiences divorce, they are 60% higher risk of teen pregnancy. They are 40% higher risk of jail time. They're 45% higher risk of early death. Children of divorce earn lower wages than their counterparts, and they possess a lower likelihood of going to college. Children pay for divorce. That's what we learn societally. And so, what does this mean for the church? What are our big takeaways? I think they're twofold. Number one, I think what we recognize is that we live in a culture that is swimming with people who have just been decimated by divorce. And so the church has to be a beacon of hope for them. We have to recognize that the cross of Christ pays for divorce and adultery, just like it pays for every human sin, and that there is redemption in Jesus Christ. The other thing we have to do as a church, capital C church, is we have to recognize that children of divorce have a much heavier burden to bear than other children. And so if it's true that they have a higher risk of teen pregnancy, jail time, early death, lower wages, less likely to go to college, the church has to make it their mission to step into that void and make it so that the children in their midst that are experiencing divorce are the exception to these statistics. The church has to be that outpost of the kingdom that we are called to be. And if we can't reverse divorces that have already occurred, then we have to be the place that cultivates thriving once more for these children, so that they aren't what these stats say is likely to happen. So that's what we covered on Sunday. Remember, friends, there are no hard scriptures. There are only hard hearts, but Christ takes our hard heart away and gives us a new heart, and he puts God's Spirit within us. So God bless you, and I hope you all have a wonderful week. We'll see you on Thursday for a sermon preview.